I was raised by women. I was raised in a space where we knew that children belong to all the women around us, sisters, aunties, mothers. And so seeing so many women gathered in one place feels like coming home. And it's such a special feeling. Hearing Kate speak made me feel like maybe I need to move to Pasadena. So don't be surprised to see me back here. So in the beginning, well before books and writing, there was my grandmother's voice. They were my grandmother's words. I remember how during my childhood we would gather in her village kitchen after dinner, sit around the fire and watch her tell stories. I say watch instead of listen because in the old woman's stories I saw a universe awaken and come alive. It was a vivid and delightfully enchanting universe in which animals could talk and hang out with humans, seduce and marry beautiful women. It was a universe where horrible creatures sometimes gobbled up children like ourselves, leaving us terrified out of our senses and unwilling to walk in the dark to go to our bedrooms at the end of the night because we knew from our grandmother's stories what awaited us in the shadows. And then there was my father, a man of humor and wit and imagination who told stories about his lived experience. When I came along, my father and my mother had 8 children, and I was the last on my mother's side. And he had 6 girls, and I believe he was dreaming for boys because I have an older sister whose name means enough girls. I come from a culture of colorful names where, for those of you who have had the chance to look at the book, I come from a culture where names speak. And so that was my older sister's name. And I came along, and my middle name is The Girls Are Many. So that I guess he was still pushing for boys. And sure enough, when he remarried, he got 2 boys with my stepmother. So I think he's, the name spoke to the right authority. But not having enough, not having boys when I was growing up means I was a victim of my father's storytelling in a way, because culturally the normal thing would be for him to sit around with his boy children and tell stories. So I guess I was a replacement and stood in and listened to these amazing stories of his boyhood in the 40s and 50s, the ancestors I never met, the Zimbabwean War of Independence that seemed to haunt him. To listen to my grandmother and father was to be audience to a language so evocative and powerful it could transport. And it was there, in that universe of language and imagination, that the writer in me was born, though I didn't know it at that time, and I had no interest or intention of growing up to become a writer. It all happened in Zimbabwe, in my homeland, where I was raised, and my story obviously begins. I did not realize when I left the country at the age of 18 to study law in the US, my father's sister was already living in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She had moved there decades before I was born. And over the years, she had gone to school, established herself as a nurse, and made it possible for her nieces and nephews who wanted to study to come over. So I went to study law, carrying with me a love for language and storytelling. I took my first creative writing class in college. I attended Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and I believe it was my first or second semester, at a time where I was lost in, dealing with culture shock. It was my year of silence. And what I liked about that writing class was that it didn't demand of me to interact or to speak in class, which I wouldn't have done because you really couldn't pay me to talk. But I liked that I could write whatever I wanted. And somehow it activated what at the time I thought was was lost. It activated my grandmother's stories. It activated my father's stories. And I found myself writing, and a door opened to the extent that I made myself take a writing class every semester throughout my undergrad and early graduate school years. And at this point, it was very clear to me that I had no interest in going to law school. Part of the college experience, obviously, is that it's a time of self-discovery. But for me, the discovery was not a delightful moment because I had to deal with disappointing my parents, especially my father, which is why I never really came out and told people that I was going to study my MFA. And I kept that secret until until I won this short story writing prize. But anyway, it was the right decision for me. And during my MFA years, one of the things I had to deal with was transitioning from storytelling in my language, which was the language that my grandmother and my father used, to storytelling in English, and thinking about how I was going to go about it, because it was clear to me that it wasn't going to be simple. When my characters speak to me, they speak in Ndebele, which is my native language. And the stories I tell myself in my head are told in my native language. I was and I am obsessed with words, language, sound, voice, and picture. And that is, for the most part, how I went about writing We Need New Names. Part of my education at Cornell, I did my MFA at Cornell, I omitted that, was learning that writing was hard work. It was supposed to be obvious, but I guess I wasn't thinking that way, because during my undergrad years, I wrote for fun, I wrote for pleasure, I wrote because I loved language. But fast forward to grad school, I had to learn craft, which was kind of challenging to do, because the way my father and my grandmother told stories made it sound like it was effortless. I would listen to them and I wouldn't think deeply about things like character. I knew character was important. I wouldn't think about voice and how you put it together. So those were the things I had to learn. I had to learn discipline. I remember one of my mentors, Elena Maria Viramontes, asking me if I had a writing routine. It was my first semester in college. And obviously throughout my undergrad education, I only wrote when things were assigned to me and when I wanted to. So we were talking about my process, and I said I just write when either when it comes to me or when I have to. And she said, no, you cannot work like that. You need a routine. So I quickly created one. I found myself waking up every day at 5:30 in the morning and writing. It was made easier because I was living in Ithaca, New York, and there was nothing to do. So I went to bed quite early. 9:30 I was in bed, and 5:30 I was up naturally without the aid of an alarm. But being in that space also meant being surrounded by a community of people who were not only there to write, but who were also there to care about other people's writing. And I remember I was in the US for like 13 years before I was able to go back home. So not only did I miss it, but I found a way to make writing take me home, take me, have it give me the feeling of going to a place that I couldn't physically go to. So I found myself writing a lot about the homeland. I found myself thinking a lot about the homeland, and that kind of kept it alive for me. The first thing I would do every morning was to Google my country, just to find out what was going on, what was current. And obviously, it was not always good news. Writing became about bearing witness. It became about catharsis. It became about making sense of things. It became about overcoming the feeling of powerlessness, of feeling like there was nothing I could do. I remember it was around this time that I called my father. It was after the election, the 2008 election, and an election that was eventually rigged by the government. But there was a time when people were waiting, and they knew that they had voted for change, and they felt like change was coming. Then they waited for, I think it was a few weeks, which had never happened, because our results were always announced right after, a day or two after the election. And I'd never heard my father sound so broken. He had this crack in his voice. And I realized while I was with him on the phone that I did not have the language with which to comfort my own parent. So writing We Need New Names kind of made that possible. In as much as I could not have that conversation with my father, I feel like I had it on the page, not just for him, but for other Zimbabweans who were going through the same things. It was a project that took me about 4 years. And in those 4 years, I watched it grow, change shape. And I remember that the early drafts of We Need New Names, I was working with an adult narrator, which meant that my sensibilities and my politics were very much present in the story, and not in a good way, because I felt like it was interfering with the narrative. And it was only after Darling happened. Darling is my protagonist. It's a 10-year-old girl who narrates We Need New Names. Happened to me by accident that I hit the voice that felt true, that felt like it needed to carry the book. So I after working for 3 years, I decided to take the book apart and rewrite it from Darling's perspective. What started as a big project narrowed down to this 10-year-old and her friends growing up in a shanty town named Paradise. And then she eventually moved to Michigan in a journey not unlike my own, to live with her aunt, Fosterlina. I wrote the final draft on my own after I was done with workshop. I was terrified, of course, because I was so used to relying on my classmates. But I guess sometimes you will find yourself on your own. But what carried me through in this project were the voices of my father and my grandmother, because in writing Darling's story, I realized that voice was such a big part of it. It was not just an expression of her character, it was character itself. Finding my father's and my grandmother's voices in that part of the project felt like coming full circle. And it's such an honor that today I'm able to share it with readers. Thank you so very much.